Hey, it's Ben from Digital Mastery and Masters Academy, and this time around we're going to take a look at color modes. Every time you open a picture in Photoshop, it's in a particular color mode, and that color mode determines what the image is made out of behind the scenes, and it also determines somewhat the limitations of what's available in Photoshop. And most people end up sticking with one main color mode, but on occasion you get sent files from someone else. You open them up and things just don't work normally. And you're not sure why. Well, a lot of the times it has to do with color mode. Also, if you're going to use your images for particular more unusual purposes, it might be a good idea to switch color modes. So let's take a look at all the color modes that are available, and I'll give you an idea of when I might use each one. And I'll end up starting with what I would consider the most common one, the one I use the most, and then I'll go to the least common at the end. So let's dive in and take a look at color modes. All right, when you first open an image, you can tell what mode it's in by looking at the name of the file up here at the top. Mine is called Untitled 2, which isn't too exciting. And then to the right of that, it has how much I'm zoomed in or zoomed out on the picture. And beyond that, right there is the color mode. This image is in RGB mode. Whereas if I look at the image on the far left, because I have a bunch of tabs open, this one's in grayscale mode. And if I go over to the far right, this one's in CMYK mode. And so just glancing at the title bar up here, the little tab, tells you what mode you're in. If you want to change between various modes, you can go to the image menu and choose mode. And this will have all the modes listed. Right now, you can see we're in RGB. The mode you're in also determines a bunch of other stuff in Photoshop. For instance, if I open the info panel, with default settings, the left side of the info panel, it's a little readout where if you move your mouse on top of your image, it kind of tells you how to describe the color that's underneath your mouse. Well, the setting for the leftmost side, it defaults to a choice called actual color. And that means if I'm here in RGB mode, I get RGB readouts. But if I switch to an image that's in CMYK mode, it changes how this is being measured so it matches the mode that I'm in. So now it says CMYK. Or if I switch to grayscale, the K stands for black, now it's measuring shades of gray. Then also, if I go into an adjustment, let's say I go into levels or curves. The choices for our adjustments right here is also going to be determined by what mode I'm in. So here I can adjust red, green, and blue. But if I switch to the CMYK image, and I also come in there to levels, which I might have to do with an adjustment layer because I think I have a text layer active, then it's not going to be RGB anymore. Instead, the choices I have are CMYK. And if I were to switch to a grayscale image, of course, it would give me the choice only of working on shades of gray. So why do I use RGB mode the most? Well, that's because RGB mode talks about red, green, and blue light. And those are the three colors of light that your eyes are most sensitive to. And everything you've ever seen on your computer screen is made using only red, green, and blue light. Also, any image captured with a digital camera captured it in RGB mode, because anytime you're using light, that's the mode you're in. RGB mode is also what's known as gray balanced. And that means if I come in here and use something and I choose something like, let's say, desaturate, the end result here is completely neutral gray. There's no hint of color here whatsoever. But if, on the other hand, I come in and I convert this image to, let's say, CMYK mode, and I do the same thing, image, adjustments, desaturate, the end result is not a neutral gray. I don't know if you can tell the difference or not, but this here is brownish. If I were to open the info panel and I were to get it to show you RGB numbers, the way you end up making a perfect gray is balanced RGB. Red, green, and blue would have to be perfectly equal. But if I move my mouse over here, you'll see that it's not. Instead, you'll find that red is too high, which makes this look brownish. And that means that filters and adjustments are less than ideal in CMYK mode. And so I'm going to choose undo until I get back to RGB. It's the most common color space that I work in. But then sometimes you're going to end up with a full color image that somebody sends you, and it just seems like layers don't work, filters aren't available, and that kind of stuff. When does that happen? Well, that's going to happen if somebody sends you an image like this one, where they took what used to be an RGB image and they saved it out in a special file format. And when they did, look at what it ended up with in a color mode. Over here it tells you, it says index. Well, if you ever get an image and you open the layers panel and everything's grayed out, you cannot create a new layer. You go up to the filter menu and everything's grayed out. And you go to adjustments and next to nothing's available. Then all it means is it's not in a normal mode and you need to convert it to RGB mode. Then layers will become available, filters will become available, and so on. But let's close that image because we were just talking about RGB mode. With each one of these modes, there's usually a little bit more to know about it. And in this case, what's a little more to know about RGB mode is if you go to the lower left corner of your image, there's some text down there. And the text you get depends on what settings you choose from this little pop-up menu. If you choose the choice called Document Profile, it will tell you the name of what they call the colors of red, green, and blue your image is made out of. Because you can make an image out of really vivid shades of red, green, and blue, or mellower shades of red, green, and blue. And that's a setting you'll have to know about that we'll talk about in a different video, where we talk about what's known as RGB color spaces. But it's something you should know that relates to RGB mode, and what it's going to mess up with you right now is if you click on your foreground color and you ever talk on the phone to somebody and say, hey, grab this exact color blue right here, and you just read off these numbers to them and they type the same numbers into their color picker. Well, if their RGB color space is not the same as what you're using, those numbers don't represent the exact same color, so their results will look a little different. But like I say, we'll get into that in a different video. Now let's talk about the second most common mode that I use, and that would be grayscale mode. Well, you can pull all the color out of an image when you're in RGB. All you need to do is choose Image, Adjustments, and either use the adjustment called Black and White or just choose Desaturate. Black and White will give you a lot more control and usually a higher quality end result, but for now I'm just going to choose Desaturate, which I think will just make this a gray circle. This I could also get if I convert to grayscale mode. And let's try to figure out why might we want to do that. Well, the first thing is when you're in RGB mode and all you have is shades of gray. If you look at what your image is made out of, which is what's in the channels panel, you'll find what you have is a red, a green, and a blue channel, and they all look identical. They're absolutely identical. And therefore, we don't really need an image that is that big, that's got three absolutely identical channels. We could just choose Image, Mode, Grayscale. And now, instead of having three identical ones, we just put what was in there in a single channel. And that means if I save an image when it's in grayscale mode, it's going to take up 1/3 the amount of space on my hard drive. But that's not the only reason you go to grayscale mode. If you're going to print on a printing press, if you supply an RGB image, it's going to not know that it's not a color picture. And therefore, it's going to print that grayscale looking picture using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. And that's going to end up costing a lot more money than printing it only with black ink. And if one of those colors is printing a little bit heavy on the printer, which is not uncommon, then what should look like a grayscale picture is going to look slightly bluish or slightly reddish as one of those colors is printing a little bit heavier. So if we convert to grayscale mode, then when it gets sent to a printing press, it knows to only print that image using black ink. It's going to cost a lot less, and you're going to ensure that the image looks neutral. It doesn't look like a hint of a particular color. When you're working in grayscale mode, it's kind of weird. When you click on your foreground color and you try to pick a shade of gray, this isn't really lined up with grayscale mode. It still presents you with colors and shades of those colors. So if you want to pick shades of gray, ignore the color picker. Instead, go to the window menu and choose color. And this will offer you the choice on the side menu of grayscale slider and a choice of grayscale ramp. The part at the bottom, this part, is the ramp. So then you can pick your shades of gray here, and you could just visually pick them from below if you'd like. That's much better than using the color picker when you're in grayscale mode. Then be careful if you come up here and you try to save your image. If you choose many of the choices found under export, such as save for web, you should know that this is always going to convert your image to RGB mode, which is going to make it 3 times larger than what it was previously. That is if you use JPEG, which is the file format primarily used for photographs. And it doesn't matter if you turn on this checkbox or not, it will still convert your image to RGB mode, and it'll be 3 times as large of a file size. If you want to avoid that, then stay away from the choices designed for saving through the internet, and instead come to the File menu and choose Save As. When you're in Save As, here I'll say on my computer, this bugs the hell out of me. I wish Adobe would get rid of this. I've never wanted to save it to the cloud. Sorry, rant. Saved to my computer. And anyway, here, if I choose JPEG, when I'm in grayscale mode, this will only save grayscale. And therefore, the file size would be 1/3 the size of RGB, which would be nice. But there's always a little bit more to know about most of these things, and in the case of grayscale, there's more than one version of grayscale. If you go to the Edit menu, there's a choice down here called Color Settings. And when I converted to grayscale, it looked at what setting was right here. And that determined what version of grayscale I ended up with. When I say there's 2 versions, there's one that has this setting called dot gain. That's designed for printing on a printing press. And the dot gain tries to compensate for the fact that the ink absorbs into the paper and spreads out, and that makes it look darker. And this tries to compensate for that. The other choice is gamma, and gamma is used when you display an image on screen, like on the internet. And so you should have it either set to one of the dot gain numbers if you print on a printing press, or one of these numbers if you just display the image on screen. 2.2 would be most common for on screen. And what you choose up here would depend on what kind of paper you're using. If you use really, really cheap paper, you need to have a high dot gain. And if you use really nice glossy paper, you can get away with lower dot gain. But the main thing is, you probably don't want to convert to grayscale mode until you know the printing conditions that will be used, so you can choose it here before you convert. But that's the subject of a different video that I'm not going to get into right now, because we're just trying to talk basically about the color modes. So now I'm going to choose undo a few times and try to get back to our full color image in RGB mode. The next mode that I use most commonly is one that is called indexed color. Indexed color mode is not something that I usually convert into by choosing this menu choice. Instead, I just happen to end up in that mode, and it happens most commonly when I choose File, Export, and I try to export to the internet. Let's say I use Save for Web, and I choose up here either GIF or I choose Ping 8. Both of those settings are good for saving images that would end up being used on the internet that are graphics instead of photographs. And so anytime I use Ping 8 or GIF, the end result, when I hit the Save button down here, I'll save this to my desktop, and I'll call this one PNG 8, so I remember what file format I used. Then if I were to reopen that image that I just saved, it's right here, then it looks a little odd. That's only because I'm viewing it at 50%. And if I zoom up to 100%, that's the only time you have a true accurate view of your image. It looks much like when I was in that save screen. But now my layers aren't available and my filters aren't available. And if I want to get any of that back, I need to change the mode out of index color and most likely into RGB. And then filters are available, layers are available, and all that. And if I were to ever resave this image as a Ping 8 or as a GIF file, it would get converted back to index color mode. But index color mode could only have 256 colors or less. That's why this doesn't look as smooth as the original picture. But that makes your file size get a lot smaller, and when you have graphics instead of photographs, it usually looks fine, like for a logo. And I had an entire lesson about bit depth, and the first one talked about between 1 and 8 bits, and that had to do with things like index color mode, so you're more than welcome to go and watch that video if you have a lot more interest in that topic. I'm going to choose undo a few times and close this image so I can get back to my normal RGB file. And let's move on to the next color mode. The next color mode that I use most frequently after index color would be CMYK mode. What do I use CMYK mode for? Well, CMYK is used for printing on a printing press because it's talking about colors of ink: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. They don't use B for black because some people refer to cyan as blue, and so they didn't want to have any confusion. The letter K, you could say, stands for key because they use black to line things up registration-wise. But CMYK mode, let's convert into that. Now, I would only use CMYK mode if I'm going to print on a printing press. I would not use it if I'm printing on an inkjet printer, because inkjet printers usually have more than just cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink built in. They sometimes have multiple shades of those, and sometimes they also have additional colors like orange ink built into the printer. And this wouldn't know how to deal with that. So for an inkjet printer on your desk, leave it in RGB mode. It's only when you're going to go on a printing press that I would end up going to CMYK mode. CMYK files will be larger than RGB images, and that's because RGB images are only made out of 3 channels, that's red, green, and blue, whereas CMYK images also have a 4th channel, which is for black. This image happens to not use any black, but that makes the image a little bit larger than an RGB image. When you convert to CMYK mode, you're going to find, I'll switch to this image for the demo, you're going to find whenever you convert, it always asks you if you should flatten your image. And let me show you why I'd suggest you always do, if at all practical. This image is already in CMYK mode, and I tried to make the green glow around this text to be the most vivid green that CMYK mode is capable of reproducing. Well, I made that in CMYK mode, and I'm going to convert it to RGB. It was made out of layers, just so you know. So here's a text layer, and there's an effect that's giving it a glow. I don't think this curves layer is doing anything. And I'm just going to choose Image Mode RGB, and watch what happens to the green when I choose Don't Flatten. It became more intense, more vivid, and that's actually what I wanted. That's what the green looked like when I chose it out of my color picker when I was making this effect. But then I'm going to convert this right back to CMYK mode, and you might think, well, that green can't be made in CMYK mode. Well, sure it can. When I choose CMYK, it asks this question. If I choose Don't Flatten, which I know would be convenient, so you'd still have a text layer and you'd still have this outer glow to adjust, but watch what happens if I don't flatten the image. Watch the green. Do you see how mellow it became? It just doesn't look anywhere near as good. I'll choose Undo, and then I'm going to convert to CMYK mode again, and this time I'm going to flatten the image. Watch what happens to the green, and notice we're in CMYK mode, and that green did not change. And that's because if you have the layers combined together when you're in RGB mode, the math is much simpler on how that's done, and it can usually create a smoother and better looking end result. And so when you're asked if you want to flatten your image when you're converting to CMYK mode, say yes, unless you have a very good reason not to. And with most modes, there's a little bit extra. And here's the little bit extra for CMYK mode that I'm only going to hint on in this video. And that is, when you convert to CMYK mode, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and it goes up to the Edit menu, and it looks at what's found over here in Color Settings. And it looks right here, where it says CMYK Working Space. And this determines how it converts to CMYK mode. If you're going to print on newspaper, like in a normal newspaper, you might need to be on this setting. And therefore, it would compensate for how cheap that paper is and how much the ink will just absorb in and spread out and look darker. If, on the other hand, you're going to print on a glossy sheet of paper for really high quality brochure, you might need this setting. So it doesn't compensate quite as much for the ink absorbing into the paper, and your image would look better for that particular purpose. But if you don't yet know how your image is going to be printed, or this image will be used for more than one type of printing, then I wouldn't convert to CMYK mode yet. But this is the topic we could get into in a different video. You should just be aware of it so you don't casually convert to CMYK mode and think, hey, I'm good to go for printing on a printing press. You're not. You need to make sure that those settings were right before you go there. So now let's take this same image and let's talk about our next mode. And the next mode that I use is one called bitmap mode. Now, bitmap mode is grayed out at the moment, and that's because it can't deal with color, because bitmap mode ends up making your image out of only pure black and pure white. In order to get to it with a color image, you first need to get rid of the colors by converting to grayscale. Then you can choose image mode bitmap. And when you do, you get two questions. The top question here is, what's the output resolution you want? And most of the time, bitmap mode is used when you're printing on some sort of printer. It doesn't have to be a printing press. It could be a label printer on your desk. It could be a restaurant receipt printer, that kind of thing. And right down here, you would type in the resolution of that printer. And that makes sure that the dots we end up with here are just the right size, the same size as the dots that the printer would use. Then down here where it says method, we have a few choices. In this says, what should we do with the shades of gray that are in this picture, since bitmap mode can only have solid black and solid white. With 50% threshold, anything darker than 50% would turn black, anything brighter would turn white. With diffusion dither, it would use tiny little dots to try to simulate shades of gray, but those dots would be too small to be used on a normal printing press. They might be fine though for a restaurant receipt printer. And then halftone screen is what would be used on a printing press. And if you use halftone screen, when you click OK, it'll ask you settings for that too. But that's for a different lesson if you want to truly get into that stuff. All right, then let's zoom out on our picture. Here's the end result. This is currently made out of pure black and pure white. I know it looks like we still have shades of gray in there, but we don't. That's only because we're viewing this image at 11% magnification. We're zoomed out of this image amazingly. And so I'm going to zoom in, and it's only when I get into 100% view that you'll see an accurate view of what this image is truly made out of, and you'll see it's made out of solid black and solid white, and no shades of gray whatsoever, just solid black and solid white. In this time, using what's known as a halftone, which is different sized kind of ovals to represent where we used to have shades of gray. So this is great if I have my signature that I just scanned, or I have a black and white logo, or if I want to print on a restaurant receipt printer. Then bitmap mode is where I'd want to go. So let's close this image and let's get back to this one. I'm going to choose undo on this image because I see we're in CMYK mode. I think undo will get me back to RGB. The next mode that I use is one called lab mode. What's unique about lab mode is, unlike RGB and CMYK mode, is lab mode separates brightness from color. When I'm in RGB mode, if I go to levels or curves and I work on red, green, or blue, or all three of them at once, doesn't matter, I'm always shifting brightness as part of what I'm doing, even if all I'm trying to do is shift color. Same is true in CMYK mode, but in lab mode it's different because the L in lab mode stands for lightness. And so if I'm in lab mode and I go to something like levels or curves, you're going to find that the channels are labeled lightness up here at the top. And if I do lightness, it's going to only change the brightness of our picture. And when I do so, it should not shift the colors, meaning that something that was green should remain green. Something that's red will remain red. But if I change here to A, then working with A would shift the colors. If I shift it in one direction, I'm going to go towards, when it comes to A, magenta or towards green. And it depends on which one of these sliders I move, but I'm going to be going between magenta and green. If I go to B, I'm going to instead be going between cyan and yellow. So one direction will make it much more cyan, the other direction much more yellow, depending on which one of these adjustment sliders I use. So what is lab mode really good for? Well, if you happen to have an image and you want to exaggerate the difference between either green and magenta or between yellow and cyan, then lab mode's really useful. But I wouldn't casually switch to it if there's not a huge advantage, because anytime you switch between color modes, there's a lot of rounding involved. So I'm going to choose undo here. And what I mean by rounding is, imagine you were converting measurements, like you're measuring your sofa, and you measured it in inches. But when you did, you only measured in whole inches. You didn't go to half inch and quarter inch. You used the whole numbers. Then you converted that from inches into centimeters. But when you use centimeters, you only used whole centimeters. Well, there'd be some rounding involved. And if you convert to that, let's say centimeters, and then convert back to inches, you might not end up with the exact same end result, especially if you made a little bit of a shift in the size of your sofa when you were in that other measurement system, just like if you made an adjustment when you're in lab mode. And when you do that, all it means is you're not going to have as much fidelity in your colors when you switch between those modes. So only go to lab mode and back to RGB, which is the most common conversion, if you have a good reason. The technique you're using in lab mode has enough value and enough quality difference in your picture that it's worth having a little bit of a loss in the conversion process. All right, the next mode that I use in here is multi-channel. What the heck is that for? Well, multi-channel is something where, let's say you went to CMYK mode with an image, you could then convert it to multi-channel. And if you did, it would still be made out of, if you went to the channels panel, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. But now you could add additional channels, which means additional colors of ink. And therefore, maybe there's a color within your picture that can't easily be reproduced in CMYK mode. It's a unique color of purple, or maybe it's metallic silver, it's metallic gold. Well, you can't make that out of these. Instead, you have to buy that color of ink. Or maybe you want to use that would be known as a bump plate, by the way. Or maybe you want to use a gloss varnish and only have it go over part of your picture. Well, then you could define it in multi-channel mode as another one of these channels, and you just call it gloss varnish. And then the printing company would get an extra printing plate when it comes out, and they'd know what to print using that. The other time I would use multi-channel mode, let's close this up, is when I had an image like this one, and I wanted to print it on a printing press. Well, if I just send this to have printed on a printing press, they would print this by default using 4 colors of ink: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that means 4 printing plates and paying for 4 colors of ink. But if I was able to somehow reduce this down to only printing with black ink, like black where the tires are and 50% gray out here where this is, and then a different color, let's say red ink to make this, like a Pantone color. And the only thing I'd have to give up is I wouldn't be able to have orange in here, because you can't make orange out of red and black. But that wouldn't be a big sacrifice. And then this would cost less to print if I'm only printing with 2 colors of ink. Multi-channel mode would be good for that. So if somebody gives you an image that comes in multi-channel mode, no, you can convert it to RGB if you don't need to use it to print on a printing press. And then it'll be a normal image. Now let's close that image and let's look at the final mode that we haven't used yet. And that's one called duotone. Now, duotone will often be grayed out. It'll be grayed out anytime you have a color picture. And that's because you have to first go to grayscale mode before you go to duotone. So what the heck is a duotone? Well, a duotone is a grayscale picture that is printed with more than 1 color of ink. In here, a monotone would mean 1 color of ink. It just might mean not black, like print this with red ink or something. Duotone being 2 colors of ink, tritone is 3, and quadtone is 4. And most commonly in here, you start with a preset, which is what this menu is, and you choose from one of these. So if I end up choosing one of these, let's say I choose this, right now this is made out of 3 colors of ink. And I could switch from this to any of the others. And it's going to change what color of ink this image is made out of and its general appearance. There are also some in here that use the normal magenta and yellow colors in here, so you'll see magenta and yellow. And all this is it still treats it as a grayscale picture. If you look over here in the channels panel, it'll show one channel. It still thinks it's grayscale, and then it just assigns these colors of ink to it, and then it gives you these things, which are tone curves, to say where should those colors of ink be used. And you can even click on these little things and change them. So let's say I want a lot of yellow in the bright part of the image. I'd have to pull this up, see the bright parts over here, and maybe do that to get a lot of yellow in there. Maybe even go further to get that to really look more colored. There we go. Now we're getting some yellow. And then maybe I want more magenta in the dark part. I could click on this and I can say, okay, here's the dark part. Let's just shove more magenta in there, hopefully to get more color in there. And just not so much in the bright areas because that's where you want it yellowish. We'll do that. Click OK. And then it's hard to see that magenta in here because we have so much black. So let's click on the curve for black. And in the dark area, let's pull it down a bit so some more of the magenta can show through. But let's not pull it down in the bright areas so much. All right, so we could mess with these curves if we wanted to. But for most people, unless you're really printing on a printing press with this kind of a setup, you wouldn't mess with those. You just use the curve or the preset that's up here. And then you can click on OK. Now, that's not only used for printing on a printing press. Even if you're using something for the internet or just on screen, you might go to duotone mode simply so you can get to these presets to tint your picture. And then after you've tinted your picture, like I have here, just change the mode. Change it to RGB. And now you have the same look in your picture, but your image is now made out of red, green, and blue light, which is used for the internet and for most things. And you just happen to be able to tint your photograph with color like that using those presets, which can be nice. So now, hopefully, you have an idea of what all those modes mean that you find in the image mode menu. And therefore, if somebody gives you a picture that's in an odd mode, you get a duotone. You're like, hey, I like the look of the picture, but why can't I do stuff with all the features that are in Photoshop? Well, if you're not going to print the image on a printing press, then just convert it to RGB mode. It should look the same, but now all the features become available. And now you know why maybe it's not the best thing to work in CMYK mode when you're going to use adjustments and filters, because it's what's known as not being gray balanced. A lot of things produce dark brown instead of gray when they were supposed to. And just in general, you can't really say you mastered Photoshop unless you know what all those choices mean. And that is why we covered them. I'm Ben Wilmore, and I'll see you next time.